Hello everyone, my name is Shanice and welcome back to my channel. As I promised in my May 2022 wrap up, the next video, which is this one that you're watching right now, is dedicated completely to my experience reading Don Quixote in the month of May. Starting late last year, I decided to challenge myself to read at least one big chunky book per month. There are two reasons why. One is because I feel like these are the books that everyone always recommends. These are the ones that are always on the list of books that you have to read before you die. So, in one part it's because I just want to finally experience what they're all about. But two, and sort of primarily, I chose to do it because I really want to get through my physical TBR. I've owned some of these books for years and obviously have never gone to them, and yeah, I'm one of those people that is very bothered by this. I know for other people they like collecting books and that's a hobby and there's nothing wrong with that, but I aspire to having a bookshelf of books that I've read. I want that feeling of going to a bookstore and picking up a new book that I can read right away because I don't have 300 books at home that I have to prioritize. I sometimes having a big TBR has made reading a bit of a chore, which is sad to say. But anyway, that is the backstory for why I gave myself this challenge. And luckily for May, that challenge was to read Don Quixote. The full title in Spanish is El Ingenioso Hidalgo Don Quixote de la Mancha, or in English, The Ingenious Gentleman Don Quixote of La Mancha. It is of course written by Miguel de Cervantes Saavedra. It was published in two parts. The first part or book was published in 1605, and the second part or book was published 10 years later in 1615. This was written in a time when what we know now as Spain was ruled by the House of Habsburg, and Cervantes wrote this in early modern Spanish. To this day, Don Quixote is still considered one of the most translated pieces of literature in all of history, and it's often considered the first European modern novel. Though some people will dispute that. They would say that, it appeared a little bit earlier, maybe in the 14th century. So what is this book all about? So it follows a man whose real name is Alonso Quijano. He gives himself the name Don Quixote. He's very much inspired by romantic chivalric novels. He feels that he is a knight-errant, and because of that, he needs to find a squire. So he looks around his town of La Mancha, and he finds a farmer, Sancho Panza, and he makes him his squire. And so this huge book follows these two men and the horse Rocinante and a donkey who is always called the Gray. We follow them all throughout Spain in a bunch of misadventures and shenanigans. A bunch of hijinks ensue. So considering the length of this book and the fact that I gave myself 1 month to read it, I initially set out to read about 30 pages per day. You will see with my vlog that backfired completely. I was overambitious in thinking that that was possible. I would not have been able to finish it without the accompaniment of the audiobook narrated by George Guidall, sped up to quite a bit. But yeah, that was the only way really that I could have been able to finish this book in 1 month. Also, I'm using this Harper Perennial edition translated by Edith Grossman. Alrighty, so I'm gonna put this down. But now I will cut to the actual failed vlog. I say failed, and you will see why. There were some days I missed. You'll see. But I did a good sort of short compilation of some of the days that I spent reading this book. So I will cut to that now, and I will meet you at the end of the video just to talk about my overall thoughts of the book. So editing Shanice now will insert the vlog. It is May 6th and 11:02 a.m. and I have barely made any progress on this book. Yesterday I did read the introduction and the translator's note by Edith Grossman and maybe 10 pages of the actual novel itself. I even filmed yesterday, but I couldn't manage to upload any of that footage to my computer. So just a little bit of a recap As far as the translator's note goes, I thought it was interesting. You know, I think translation is its own art form, and I'm always really curious about how translators go about making their linguistic choices and how they make the decision to either stay very literal to the translation or take liberties in translating some cultural phrases that are specific to a region, you know, just how they interpret all of this and go about their translation. I always find that really interesting. Some things that I found interesting that Edith Grossman mentioned were that one, she hesitated over the spelling of Quixote's name. She ultimately made the choice to spell it with an X instead of a J because she wanted the connection to the English word quixotic to remain. And so she didn't want to confuse readers over that. She also talks about how she went about making the choice to include footnotes. She went back and forth on whether or not to do so. And she ultimately did because there are a ton of footnotes in this edition. Then the intro by Harold Bloom. Wasn't a huge fan of it. You know, in introductions, I usually like the whoever is the essayist for the introduction to outline some of the major themes that I'll be looking for, just some of the important plot points or character traits or author quirks that I as a reader should expect. And I thought Harold Bloom did very little of that. It was more of his very short, very personal analysis of the novel. I mean, the one thing that I would say he did mention that I thought was interesting is how Cervantes includes himself into the narrative and how he himself should be counted as one of the characters. Harold Bloom does compare Cervantes to Shakespeare, and Shakespeare's Hamlet specifically, and King Lear. But generally, the intro is interested in answering or not answering what is the true object of Don Quixote's quest. That is what the intro is about. And I mean, Harold Bloom can honestly write whatever he wants. He has a line where he says, Cervantes and Shakespeare, who died almost simultaneously, are the central Western authors, at least since Dante, and no writer since has matched them. Not Tolstoy or Goethe, Dickens, Proust, Joyce. I'm sure many people would disagree. Something else that I noticed about the translator's note and the introduction is that it seems like Harold Bloom and Edith Grossman, I guess their definition of Hispanic includes Spain. It's one of those terms that doesn't have a solid definition, you know, it's kind of like the term Middle East. In my world, in my view, I wouldn't consider Spain part of Hispanicity just because, like, it seems extremely convenient that Spain always has to be included. Like, why can't there be just a term for the world that was once colonized by Spain? Like, why is Spain part of this? I get linguistically it's Spanish speaking, but why not just say Spanish speaking instead of Hispanic? But yeah, because there's not like a solid definition of this, I can't totally blame them. I think on Wikipedia that's the definition that's used, but for me it's a no-no. And I did end up reading the prologue, which is really short, and then the little chapter right after that, which is essentially a bunch of poetry from some of the characters, some important characters either in the book or in history, writing poems to the memory of the great Don Quixote, and then some of them write poems to Sancho Panza and also some poetry to the horse. The prologue really sets up how many layers of metafiction we'll encounter throughout the novel, and it is quite ironic because the narrator, who is essentially Cervantes, he is writing in his prologue complaining about how he doesn't want to start the book with a prologue because he doesn't like prologues in other books, but he's saying this within his own prologue. And then the whole prologue that we do get is him consulting with a friend who basically tells him to plagiarize, and like it's like a cheat sheet of how to just be a knockoff of other people's work, or like the friend wants the narrator to just, to sound smart, just insert a bunch of quotes and like quote the Bible, and people will think that you're super smart and they'll believe that you did a lot of research. Copy the bibliography from this book. And one of the footnotes states that actually that author who wrote that book was known to sort of make up his bibliographies, which adds to that humor. So yeah, the whole prologue is itself pretty ironic. And then also in the prologue, the narrator starts talking about how he also doesn't want to include poetry, doesn't want to include sonnets. That is not going to be part of the work. But like I mentioned, the chapter right after that is entirely made up of poetry and some sonnets. Okay, so yeah, I am going to swiftly continue this chunky book. And yeah, I think I'm gonna read for maybe like an hour or an hour and a half, we'll see. Update. It is a little while later. I've stopped. I'm on page, I think 38. Yes, 38. I'm starving, so I'm just gonna make some lunch. I think I'm gonna make some pasta. I'll pick this up a bit later because after I eat, I'm probably gonna take a walk, maybe, I don't know, get a coffee, something. I just don't want to be inside for that much longer. Yeah, I'm gonna eat because I'm really hungry now. But yeah, I'll catch up with you guys later on. I think I'm gonna, yeah, take a break, eat, relax a little bit more, and then read a little bit later today. Okay, so this vlog is clearly a fail. It is now May 25th, 19 days later. I haven't really filmed anything because I haven't really been reading much of Don Quixote. I've just had other books that I was more interested in. So the whole plan of reading just, like 30 pages every day failed. I did listen to like a few minutes here and there of the audiobook, so I made it to page 144 since the last time, but nowhere near where I wanted to be by May 25th. And so in the last 6 days of the month, I am going to push myself to finish this. My plan today is to make it to page 250 at least. If I read more, even better. But if I stick to that sort of read 150 pages per day until the end of the month, I should be able to finish. It's a 940 page book, so I have a long ways to go. Yeah, so far I'm sort of enjoying it. Nothing remarkably funny, as I expected. This is considered like one of the funniest books ever. But yeah, I've laughed out loud a couple of times. But it is enjoyable. It's fun. It's a little silly and entertaining. But yeah, I am going to hunker down and just read until the month ends. Hello everyone. It is now 3:48, a little bit later in the day. I'm crouching down because I'm too lazy to set up a tripod. I have reached my page 250 reading goal for today. I'm officially on page 254. And actually I am probably going to read a little bit more later on in the evening, maybe like before I go to bed or something. For now, I'm going to just take a break. I also have a meeting in about 11 minutes, so this is just a quick update. So I'm not going to lie, I want to be honest. I'm not completely blown away by the novel so far. I more like appreciate what it's doing rather than enjoying it so far. I'm not finding it as hilarious, like I said. There are, though, some genuinely funny moments, like the library burning scene. That's great. I like the scene with the galley slaves. And then lines here and there. And I do like some of the discussions that Don Quixote and Sancho Panza are having together about these big themes. Sancho Panza is kind of the voice of reason sometimes, and Don Quixote is just he's a little bit crazy. I think my main problem is that it is so digressive. Now, obviously, I came into this expecting that, yeah, it gets a little bit overwhelming and tiring sometimes. I think it also doesn't help that a couple of months ago I read The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas, and that one is extremely digressive too, so I think I'm worn out from the very short chapters where one character goes off and does something, and all the disguises and different identities that people don to confuse others. Like, yeah, it's common for novels during that time period, but I guess as a modern reader, sometimes I would just like some focus. Not to say again that I'm hating this. This is enjoyable, but just I'm not feeling the overwhelming love so far, which is a little sad because I really, really want to love this book. The good news is that apparently the second half of the book, part 2, is supposed to be a little bit more realistic, more focused, less digressive, and sort of reflexive of all the themes that were happening in part 1. So who knows, maybe by the second half I'm gonna really, really love this book. But yeah, so far, okay read, solid. But hoping that it gets better very soon because I don't want to be bored for the majority of this book. So yeah, I can't promise I will be filming reading tonight, just because I don't feel like setting this camera up. I have no idea how people vlog all day, every day. This is crazy. But yeah, I'll see. I'll catch up with you when I catch up with you. Oh, and also these like little sticky things, like I don't see the point. I've honestly just been underlining things. That seems to be the method that works for me. Like the post-its are more aesthetic than purposeful for me. You know, I know a lot of people love them and it does help them, but yeah, I don't think that trend is going to be for me for the remainder of this vlog or for the remainder of my reading life later. Hello everyone, it is now May 27th, 2:11 p.m. So just to give a bit of an update, I am now on part 2, and I think the reason why I am enjoying this one much more than part 1 is that Cervantes is in a way addressing all the negative criticism that he received for part 1, that there were too many tangents, too many side stories, random inclusions of novels that didn't really have anything to do with the main plot, that there wasn't really a main plot. It was just a bunch of, like I said, digressive adventures. People were annoyed by that, and he realized this. And so in part 2, he basically addresses all of them. He has characters wonder who the hell the narrator is, because by part 2, Don Quixote's story is quite popular, and the story that becomes popular is what we read as part 1. And so these characters now are wondering, like, who the hell is the narrator? Who was around us this whole time that managed to record our history? Like, who was he or her? And then Cervantes also has characters address the sort of slips that happened in the narration in part 1. So with Sancho Panza, people often wondered, like, what happened to his donkey, who stole it, and how did it magically reappear, because in part 1 that happens and it's never really addressed. And then that's sort of addressed in part 2, which I thought was really funny and clever. And part 2 also has a bit of a calmer Don Quixote. He's still, a little bit crazy, still really convinced that he's a knight and that everyone around him just has little imagination. But in part 2, he's a little bit calmer, like I said, in the beginning at least. He does continue his adventures from part 1, but they are more focused. They're a little bit longer, the scenes featuring his adventures. I think the plot is doing some interesting things in terms of doubling and performance, and it's been doing really interesting things with themes of literature and idealism and how people use literature as escape, and even on the themes of madness and the church. I think there are a lot of parts in here where, yes, Don Quixote is out of it, but often he's the one who can see the wrongdoing and the corruption, whereas the sane people around him can't. And he namely can sort of see the hypocrisy within the church. And for those of you who don't know, part 1 was published in 1605, and then part 2 was officially published in 1615. But according to the footnotes, something that I discovered was that in 1614 there was a fake second part published, and though the identity of the author isn't officially known, he went by the name of Alonso Fernandez de Avellaneda, and Cervantes discovered this while writing the official part 2. And throughout part 2, we get a ton of moments where Cervantes is being petty and sort of insulting this second narrator, the second author, who totally destroyed the real true history of the first part that he wrote, by making up this nonsense in this unofficial second part. And that is scattered throughout part 2, at least the part 2 that I have read so far. So I'm loving this. I think the metafictional aspects that I did like in part 1 are just stronger in this one too. I think because there's more focus and a little bit more organization and clarity, that the jokes are also better. So yeah, I'm happier now that I've gotten over part 1. Okay, future me is back, and it's actually June 1st, and I've had a few days now to marinate in the text and just sift through and organize my thoughts. I think with every, important novel that I read, I try to learn something. Usually that tends to be like historical facts. So I thought I'd share with you just a few cool historical facts about Don Quixote, because, yeah, I think it's important to just walk away with a book with more than just an enjoyment of the text. You just want to feel impacted and new upon reading it. So I've already mentioned how influential and important this book has been, but some of the authors and specific novels that this book has influenced in particular are Alexandre Dumas' The Three Musketeers, Mark Twain's The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, Cyrano de Bergerac by Edmond Rostand, and I would even argue J.K. Toole's A Confederacy of Dunces. That's one of my favorite novels, one of the funniest books I've ever read. I think due for a reread pretty soon. But yeah, I would definitely say that book too has been heavily influenced by Don Quixote. The book is where we get the term Quixotic from, as well as the term Lothario, who's a side character in one of the chapters. And it's also where we have now adopted in English the idiom, the pot calling the kettle black. It existed in the Spanish language, but one of the earliest appearances of it in English was in Thomas Shelton's 1620 translation of Don Quixote. So we can thank Thomas Shelton, I guess, for bringing that idiom to English. Some other cool language things that I learned that I didn't actually have the privilege of knowing about until after I read the book. If you, for some reason, can read early modern Spanish, and you have read this text in early modern Spanish, then you would have noticed that whenever Don Quixote speaks, he speaks in Old Castilian, which was very much the language of knights and the higher class, whereas everybody else in the novel spoke contemporary Spanish, so like around whatever Spanish was spoken around the 1600s. That was a sign of his really believing that he was a knight, and so he had to replicate the language that was often used in chivalric novels because he considered himself a knight. And so if you're reading it in English like I did, you won't necessarily get that difference. I think Edith Grossman did a very good job of at least making Don Quixote speak in a sort of antiquated romantic way where we could tell that difference, but like it didn't totally hit me until after I finished reading it and I looked up some facts about the novel. But yeah, I think that's pretty cool. And this language stuff kind of extends to all the wordplay throughout the novel. You have it from just where Don Quixote is from, the town of La Mancha. I mean, La Mancha means like stain in Spanish, so that already is sort of mocking where he's from. And also, according to people, La Mancha in Spain is a real town, and it's not romantic at all. It's very barren, and it's a bunch of like dry land. So that, in addition, is sort of making a mockery of Don Quixote. Also, the name Sancho Panza, Panza is like a belly, so it's sort of gesturing towards like his weight. Also, there's comedy in the fact that Don Quixote is an hidalgo, which is pretty much a low-ranking title. And something that I found out was that hidalgo itself is a word that comes from hijo and algo, so like the son of something. So it's already pretty vague and not like specific to the propriety or the rank or the class of somebody. Don Quixote has a very, very skinny, emaciated, old horse called Rocinante, which itself is a combination of the words Rocin and Antes, the former meaning in Spanish like an old, low-ranking horse, and also can mean like an illiterate person, and then Antes being before. So it's like Cervantes' way of showing us the change in status of this old, very skinny horse from like a nag, I think that's what he's called in the book, and the foremost steed. So yeah, he has all these like little jokes within the names, within the towns. Everything is just like layered and very funny and punny. I feel like that's maybe something I missed from not reading it in the... I mean, I could never read it in the original, what is it, early modern Spanish. I can't read that. And then I feel like even reading it in Spanish, I would miss a lot of that, like, wordplay. It would be like reading Ulysses by James Joyce. Like, there's a lot. Okay, so now I will talk about just my overall thoughts. So I've already mentioned I much preferred book 2. I feel like it was way more tender and sympathetic and compassionate towards Don Quixote. Throughout book 1, I feel like it has more of a slapstick style. Don Quixote is the joke, and we're made to see him as this person who's completely lost his mind from reading all these romantic chivalric novels. He thinks of himself as like the second coming of Amadis of Gaul. He's obsessed, right? And so his view of the world has shifted a little bit, and people think that he has lost his mind. And so that is the joke. The reader is meant to also laugh at him because it is a satire of these types of romantic novels that often reworked fairy tales and other histories, and had a lot of digressive portions, were written in like short chapters. Because of that, this book itself features a lot of that. I think famously in book 1, there's just a few chapters dedicated to summarizing a random novel that a character brings up. Doesn't necessarily have much to do with the main plotline of Don Quixote and Sancho Panza, but it's just there. And so as a reader, that was very annoying to me. But the thing that annoyed me most is that, like, Cervantes knew that he was doing this intentionally to mock the books that normally did this unironically. And so, like, I get it, but then I also felt like as a reader, like, backed into a corner where Cervantes was telling me, like, oh, you can't complain because I knew that you were going to complain, but I'm purposely writing it so maybe I annoy you to point out how annoying it is, so you can't really complain. I don't know, it traps me in this place where I feel like I have to acknowledge that he knows that I'm annoyed, but also, like, maybe don't do this. And so it felt like book 1 was never ending. Yeah, book 1 I think has been studied to death. I think an abridged version of book 1 when I was in high school, and then I bought this edition for a class in college, and I only read like a few chapters in book 1. And so it does feature the very famous scene with the windmill, where Don Quixote thinks that they are a bunch of giants, but really they're windmills. A lot of the times, Don Quixote, in his mind, he thinks that he's fighting, real tough criminals, but in reality, they're like petty criminals. He sometimes unintentionally does the right thing. Like, the joke is that he takes all of this too seriously, but also he may actually be doing some good, because at one point in book 1 he also frees galley slaves. Something else that's established firmly in book 1 is the metafictional aspect of the book. In the beginning of book 1, the narrator, who is Cervantes, he says that he has found the manuscript of this book in the archives of La Mancha, and originally it was written in Arabic by this fictional author called Sidi Hamidi Benengeli. There's been a lot of dispute about, like, the origin of that name. Sidi is a corrupted version of the Arabic Said. As for the second name, Hamate, there has been dispute with that too as to what it refers to in Arabic. Some people say it refers to the name Ahmed, others claim it refers to Hamada, and others claim that it comes from the Arabic Hamid. So, dispute about that. And then the last name Benengeli comes from a version of the Arabic word for eggplants, also where the Spanish word berenjena comes from. And so throughout the text, we are constantly referred back to, Sidi Hamate, and Sidi Hamate said this, and he wrote this. And then in book 2, we get the added layer of there having, in real life, been a false second part published by another author. And so book 2 is constantly referencing that other author on top of Sidi Hamate. So there's a lot of intertextuality and metafiction weaving its way in here. There are also a lot of parts of Cervantes' real life that he includes here. Now, as to other reasons why I preferred book 2, I've already mentioned because it was more tender, more sympathetic. I thought Don Quixote came across kind of sad. He's a very old man. He's beyond his prime, and he finds in literature a sense of hope and importance. And he feels like if the characters can do it, why can't I be a knight? So let me find adventure in my real life. And it becomes sadder because in book 2, the side characters now, a lot of them are playing tricks on him. They have heard and read part 1. The characters in the book have, as well as, in real life, people have read book 1 by the time the second part has been published. But these fictional characters, now having interpreted Don Quixote as like this crazy person, now they think it's fun if they all like get together and start scheming and planning on how to trick Don Quixote into thinking that he's, fighting crime when in reality he's fighting people like hired by these side characters to play tricks on Don Quixote. So it all is very cruel in the end, and those characters are like the butt of the joke now instead of Don Quixote. We kind of take a step back and really see the story for what it is. We see more of the literary machinations that Cervantes is, weaving through this. He also, I think, does an excellent job of speaking to what happened to the Moors in Spain during the 1600s. They were expelled from Spain, and so we get some characters Cide Hamete is supposed to be of Moor descent. And then in book 2, we also get another character who is a Morisco, who is a Spanish person who is a descendant of Moors. And so that character near the end of the book is in disguise because he's not supposed to be in Spain anymore, because he's supposed to have fled outside of it, but he's back because he has hidden some like treasure. So it speaks to these like really important, I think, historical crimes, but he does it in a funny way. And there's irony. I'm on page 834 just for an example. Don Quixote is praising somebody, and so he says, this one certainly is a knight, a member of the squadrons of Christ. His name is Saint James the Moor Killer, one of the most valiant saints and knights the world has ever had and that heaven has now. Not just a commentary on how Spain treated the Moors, but also on religion, who the church values, the hypocrisy of the institution of the Catholic Church, which obviously is tied to Spanish history very much. Don Quixote and Sancho Panza in book 2 come across as more of the wise ones. Everybody around them is supposed to be sane and, clear-headed and not influenced by novels. And while Don Quixote is, and Sancho Panza, sort of follows whatever Don Quixote says, they are the ones who notice this hypocrisy in church figures. They are the ones who take notice of, like, all the corruption around them. Cervantes also points to the relationship between how women are treated in society and also how women are treated in literature, which one has influenced which, because there is a very stereotypical role that a woman must play now, and especially during these times. So the novel really talks about that, and I think criticizes the very limited and domestic role that women were supposed to play, which I thought was like pretty impressive for a novel written in the 1600s. And yes, there were still digressive stories within stories in book 2, but they were more focused to me, and I still could see how they related to the main plot. And I thought that the plot itself was just more cohesive in book 2, with the Duke and the Duchess and their tricks. I think one of the funniest portions of this entire novel for me was near the end when, so the Duke and Duchess, who are two of the people that Don Quixote and Sancho Panza come across in their adventures in book 2, they have this elaborate scheme to like trick both of them. So in one of these schemes, they hire these performers to enact a scene with like Merlin, who's the god of the underworld. And so Merlin comes out, who's just a random dude in disguise, but to Don Quixote and Sancho Panza, they actually think that it's Merlin. And Merlin tells them that the only way that they can free and disenchant Dulcinea, who is Don Quixote's love, is if Sancho whips himself 3,300 times. And just how we go about Sancho like processing this and organizing and planning for his flagellation, I mean, hilarious. Merlin tells Sancho things like, it will be of benefit to your soul and your soul because of the charity you bring to it, and your body because I know you have the sanguine temperament, and it won't do you much harm to lose a little blood. And also the part about Sancho's governorship and how he quit after like 11 days, really funny too. So yeah, this is just incredibly funny, and I think a classic worth your time. It's very long, so pace yourself much better than I did. And yeah, it'll be very fun and enjoyable. I think it's definitely worth it. It's a classic that I think meets the hype. Yeah, and you really do fall in love with these characters. And by the end, I, felt very emotional about Don Quixote. So yeah, this is a wrap. For anybody curious as to what my June book of the month is, it is Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel. We'll see how that goes. It's much shorter, so I don't have to like sprint through it as much as I did with this one. So yeah, thank you so much for watching this vlog. I hope the next one is better. I think I will actually film every single day, unlike this one. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. Like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye!